The finger of God. Exodus chapter 7 verse 19 to chapter 8 verse 19, Joel chapter 3 verses 9 to 21, and Romans chapter 9 verses 17 to 18. Introduction. Was there a point in your life where you said, "I surrender, this is the work of God"? Last week, God have made himself known to the children of Israel by bringing them out from the burdens of the Egyptians, rescuing them from bondage, redeeming them with an outstretched arm, taking them as his people and being their God, and finally, bringing them in the land as a heritage. So Moshe spoke to the children of Israel, but they did not heed him, because of anguish of spirit and cruel bondage. Verses 14 to 27 discuss the genealogy of Moshe and Aaron as descendants of Levi. These are the same Aaron and Moshe to whom God said, "Bring out the children of Israel from the land of Egypt." They're the ones who spoke to Pharaoh king of Egypt, to bring Israel out of bondage. Our parasha starts with the instruction of God to Moshe and Aaron on how to release the first plague not only over the waters of Egypt, but even their streams, rivers, ponds, and their pools. My understanding here is there's an expansion of the plague. The Nile River was always the lifeblood of Egypt, and it was also considered as a god named Hapi, which was the god of the flooding of the Nile. Commentators said, this Hapi, also known as Lord of the River, brings vegetation and harvest as well. When Aaron and Moshe lifted up the rod and struck the Nile, the fish that were in the river died and the river stank, and the Egyptians could not drink the water. I believe the reason why it turned into blood is that God will bring death to the land of Egypt, and that's the reason why all the firstborn of Egypt will die once the last plague will be released. But eventually, for the children of Israel, the blood became a redemption. For they were commanded to kill a lamb, take a bunch of hyssop, dip it in the blood and wipe it on the two doorposts of their houses, Exodus chapter 12 verse 21 to 23. The second plague is the frogs, which is the representation of the goddess Heqet. According to commentators, the Egyptians considered the frogs as a symbol of fertility. Egyptians believed that every time the frogs croak, it gives a signal to the farmers that the land is fertile again. Of course, this is an insult to God, only he can make the land fertile. Obviously, the Egyptians influenced the children of Israel to worship their gods. That's why the instruction of God to Moshe is to go to Pharaoh and tell him to let Israel go so they could serve him. This second plague leads Pharaoh to call Moshe and Aaron to entreat God to take away the frogs. But when Pharaoh saw the frogs were gone, he hardened his heart again and refused to let the children of Israel go. The third plague is gnats, which is the representation of the goddess Set, the god of the desert storms. The first two plagues are related to water, but the third is related to the land. When Aaron stretched out his hand with his rod, all the dust of the land became gnats throughout all the land of Egypt. There was this famous 5th century Greek historian named Herodotus, who believed that this plague was a message of God not only to Pharaoh, but to the Egyptian priests as well, who were sensitive against the presence of gnats, and these priests shaves their bodies to avoid any existence of gnats. These priests can't do anything to stop the third plague, and even the magicians of Pharaoh, that's why they concluded that it was the finger of God. These first 3 plagues were just the beginning of God's mighty act, and let's take a look at how he deals with every plague. First, the Nile and the frog plague had a command of God to Moshe and Aaron to go to Pharaoh. It was a private approach, to be exact, but every time Pharaoh hardened his heart, the plague was spread publicly. Regarding the gnats plague, there was no command of going to Pharaoh, for Aaron immediately stretched out his rod to create a plague. Second, God deals with the first 3 plagues by showing that he is God and only God of the universe. Exodus chapter 7 verse 17 says, "By this you shall know that I am the Lord." In Exodus chapter 8 verse 10 it says, "That you may know that there is no one like the Lord our God." Now, going back to the statement of the magicians in verse 19, what are the things that God's finger can do? 1. It can expose the limitation of enemies' power. Again, the third plague has no command from God to Moshe and Aaron to go to Pharaoh. In other words, there's no warning, and this is the reason why the magicians declared it was God's finger, for they could not copy it. 2. It can remove a veil to see the truth about God. the statement of the magicians declares that the God of Israel is real, and their false gods can't stand before him. They witnessed God's power, and they stopped duplicating the remaining plagues because what they saw caused them to see the truth about the words of Moshe and Aaron, that there is no one like the God of Israel. Pharaoh's heart remained hard. Going back to the first plague, his heart became hard, chapter 7 verse 7. While on the second plague, he hardened his own heart, chapter 8 verse 15. Then the closing of our Torah portion, it says that Pharaoh's heart grew hard, chapter 8 verse 19. Our Haftarah portion has two sections. Verses 1 to 17 is about God's judgment of the nations and the restoration of Judah and Jerusalem, and in verses 18 to 21 God will bless his people. Verse 9 gives us the climax of the chapter where God invited the wicked nations for a battle. Once they are gathered, the finger of God will unleash judgment at the valley of Jehoshaphat. The sun and moon will go dark, and the stars will diminish their brightness, which are the signs that Yeshua gave in Matthew chapter 24 verses 29 to 30. Immediately after the tribulation of those days the sun will be darkened, and the moon will not give its light, the stars will fall from heaven, and the powers of the heavens will be shaken. Then the sign of the Son of Man will appear in heaven, and then all the tribes of the earth will mourn, and they will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven with power and great glory. But there will be good news for God's people. For he will be a shelter and strength of the children of Israel, and no more aliens shall ever pass through her again. Verse 16 to 17. Judah shall abide forever and Jerusalem from generation to generation. This is how the finger of God will act. Terrible judgment for the wicked nations, but restoration, salvation, and blessing awaits for his people. Our Haftarah is a reminder to each one of us that God is faithful and just. His judgment is real, but there is hope in Messiah Yeshua. Joel chapter 2 verse 32 says, "And it shall come to pass that whoever calls on the name of the Lord shall be saved." The name Yeshua means, to save. In apostolic portion, Apostle Paul quotes Exodus chapter 9 verse 16, to show the sovereignty of God. Moving backward to verses 15 to 16, Moshe received God's mercy, but in the case of Pharaoh, he received God's judgment. 10 plagues shows how long God's patience is, but the heart of Pharaoh remained hard like a stone. Yes, Pharaoh as king of Egypt has power over the whole land of Egypt. But God is more powerful over the whole world, for he is the King of kings, and Lord of lords. Through his mighty finger, he has mercy on whom he wills, and whom he wills he hardens. The connection of our parasha is about the mighty act of God's finger. In Torah, through the third plague, the magicians declare that it was God's finger because they couldn't imitate. In Haftarah, the finger of God brings judgment to the wicked nations, but brings hope and shelter to his people. In apostolic, God raised up Pharaoh so he could show his mighty finger in him, so his name may be declared in all the earth. Back to my introduction. Maybe some of us have already recognized the finger of God just like the magicians of Pharaoh. God's finger is active in correcting us from our mistakes, reminding us when we forget to obey his words, and lastly, calling our attention every time we get off track. If you are now experiencing one of these, do not harden your heart, because the more we recognize God's finger, we will be able to follow his lead. Hebrews chapter 4 verse 7. Today, if you will hear his voice, do not harden your hearts. Shabbat Shalom.